Good evening. I'd like to welcome everybody. This is the Dan and Betsy Brown lecture series sponsored through the Provost Office. This particular event is co-sponsored by the WVU Center for Excellence in STEM Education and the Teaching and Learning Commons, who helped us make this whole thing possible. I have the immense pleasure tonight of introducing Sheila Tobias. I'm going to start out with this sort of professional introduction, and there will be a little bit of personal stuff that gets woven into that. Sheila comes to the training, the study of training in public policy career as an educator. She's been a university administrator and a longtime initiator of programs, and particularly in STEM, as well as women's studies. She was trained at Harvard and Columbia universities in history and politics to become what she calls a scholar activist. She's authored 14 books, and we do have copies of all of them that you can see, but we're going to very carefully keep our eye and make sure the table of the ones that belong to the Teaching and Learning Commons in the library do not leave. We do have some other books back here that you can get to get autographed. Among those 14 books, I think she's possibly originally best known for her work in overcoming math anxiety. That was certainly the, I think, the one that made her a household name. And then she, well, did the looking at physical science avoidance come before or after marrying the physicist? Okay. And so the physicist she married was my undergraduate advisor, and I was introduced to Sheila's works at a kind of a personal level. She was writing They're Not Dumb, They're Different, and looking at how really smart people might feel uncomfortable in a science classroom, right? Controlling all those factors you don't normally control for, and seeing that there was possibly a problem with the way science was taught. And this was, you know, during my undergraduate career, and my graduate career, I started out a particle physicist, but I ended up somebody very, very committed to trying to make science education better. So I'm not just Carl's child. They also then wrote a book together about how to succeed in math and science, breaking the science barrier. And then Sheila wrote Rethinking Science as a Career, which is kind of linked to something she's grown into where she's basically invented the professional science master's programs, which are now funded, they were funded for over 14 years by the Alfred Sloan Foundation in the US and local universities. And she's co-editor of a special issue of the journal Industry and Higher Education that was published in the United Kingdom in 2006. So lots of places. What she really is a resource to the community that's trying to make science and math education more accessible. And so I'm very proud to have helped bring that resource here. And Sheila?
Thank you. One of the things I do regularly is break the rules. And in the world I inhabit, speakers now have transparencies, or what we used to call transparencies, or slides. And instead, I have put together, with Gay's help, a handout. Remember handouts, old-fashioned, that you can refer to as needed. So that enables me to talk with you and not just at you. So what you have in your hand is really the story of my life. It was 1978, a long time ago for you, a long time ago for me. I was very interested in women's equality. For those who know some of that history, it was the period of the women's movement, arguments that women could do anything. All we had to do was remove the barriers and women would flow into all fields. But there were a couple of fields which were not opening themselves, or women were a little fearful, and it turned out not just women, but males as well. And one of those fields was mathematics at the college level, and the other one was science at the college level. Neither was my specialty. I was not a math science avoider. I had inclinations in those directions, but somehow I didn't personally get the kind of encouragement to move in those fields. But as a political science major, I was very interested in issues that bear on science and mathematics. The issue now, as we all know, is climate change, understanding it, doing something about it, the infrastructure, which in the United States is falling apart, and those of us interested in engineering are going to try to fix. And the issue more immediately for me in the 1970s was MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction, which was the acronym to describe the nuclear strategy of the Soviet states and of the US. Every one of those issues responds to a scientific analysis, not only to a scientific analysis, it's also political. But without science, you can't begin to grasp those issues. And so for me, even though I was a political science major, mastering at least enough of the conceptual level of the sciences that undergird those fields was very important. So unlike a lot of people who stop learning when they get to be 35 or so, I just opened the book as a metaphor, and decided to learn these fields. And so what I found as barriers to myself, and by extension to the students I was trying to help, comprise this handout. The first was mathematics, and what I named mathematics anxiety. Those of you who are in engineering have in your possession one of the most potent metaphors that you and anybody who's a problem solver will ever have. It's called signal to noise ratio. Have some of you encountered that already? Or should I define it? What it conveys is that where there's a problem, the problem may reside in the strength of the signal going into a system, or it may reside in the resistance of the system to the power of the signal. And we don't know that when we look at the phenomenology. It's not obvious immediately whether it's a signal problem or a noise problem. And at the time I started to work first on mathematics avoidance, that's what I called it. It was particularly common among women of a certain era, but also males who have difficulty grasping some of this. The presumption was that the problem was the signal, not the noise. So what were the counterparts of signal? What's the signal was the teaching of math, how math is imparted to learners who don't know it. The textbooks in math, how they work to convey complex ideas in mathematics. My orientation was to look at the noise. Everybody else was trying to make math teaching better, more precise, more exact, more appropriate to certain learners. I decided to look at the noise, and that comes from a metaphor of science and engineering. And my argument tonight is anybody who isn't acquainted with science and engineering is missing a most important lesson, that when you're trying to understand a big problem, you have to look at both the signal and the noise. So what was the noise in the avoidance of mathematics dynamic? For me, the noise was what students were saying to themselves as they were encountering new concepts in mathematics that were, for some of them, difficult. And that noise, I use the term noise as a metaphor, was the psychological state of the students who were in those classes in college. So here we had an army of very able math instructors working overtime with federal grants to make the teaching more substantial, more reliable, with better examples, more pictorial, trying to fix what I call the signal. And nobody in this country at that time, which is a great privilege if you're a researcher, was looking at the noise. So what is the noise? I mean, what's the equivalent of noise in the learning of mathematics? It's what a student is saying to himself or herself as she is struggling to solve a problem or take in the new information. We are systems, we humans. There's the outside, the book learning, what the teacher is imparting, and then we are ourselves. And we bring to every action an accumulation of experience, some of which can be very negative. And when it's negative, it gets in the way. So how does a researcher set up an experiment using human beings, not motion and not, machines? How does a researcher set up an experiment using human beings to test what it is that's making math difficult, harder than it should be? And so what I did was invent a number of techniques to get students who are having difficulty in math, not to just go back and do that problem again and again, not just to go to the back of the book and look for the answer and try to, extrapolate how you get there, but to look inside themselves as to what was making it difficult for them. And this was particularly effective with girls that I worked with at the time, because girls were more comfortable introspecting. That's sort of a generalization you might want to take issue with. But when I gave them an assignment, like there's one here, it's the divided page exercise, if you want to look at the divided page exercise. Their assignment was to go to a math class, one they were taking anyway, or one that I was setting up experimentally, and put a line down the middle of the note-taking page, and on the one side of the page, try to do the problem. Just obey like a good student what was being asked, whether it's a homework problem or a problem in class. And on the left-hand side of the page, try to capture in words, so that they can refer to it, what was going on in their heads, what they were thinking and feeling and noticing and not noticing about themselves solving the problem. A little bit of psychology, you might say. And what we got out of that exercise, what the learner got out of the exercise and what I got out of it in order to write about it, was insight into what was making this problem difficult for them. And so after we would go through an exercise, they were solving a problem, they were writing down their feelings in any kind of shorthand they wanted to use, then we had them read out loud from the left-hand side of the page. And that's where the real learning took place. Because once they were comfortable with one another and didn't mind revealing some of their inhibitions or their issues, there were insights right there on the left-hand side of the page, such as, I'm finished, nobody else is, I must be wrong. Or another person sitting right next to them is, I'm not finished, everybody else is, I must be wrong. Or this is just the kind of problem I can never solve, right? Hardly had they started to work. Or this reminds me of when I was in 3rd grade, I went to the blackboard, I turned my back to the enemy, the other kids in the class, and I was embarrassed because I couldn't figure out what to do. So we were digging, and I'm not a psychologist, and I don't pretend to know what the psychology was. We were digging around feelings. And feelings are not supposed to be relevant to learning mathematics. But I believe if you're not feeling able, or you're not feeling comfortable, you're not probably going to be learning very well. So after this exercise, we would have a conversation. And the young woman who said, I'm finished, nobody else is, I must be wrong, was having to talk or confront the young man who said, nobody else is finished, I am, I must be wrong, And we got them to expose these feelings, also their memories of being bested by these subjects, sometimes their memories of parents saying things that were very disconcerting. Nobody in our family does math well, you probably won't. Things that had been maybe buried, being up at the blackboard with your back to the enemy, that was often stated, until we got them to realize that they're talking to themselves as they're facing a math problem in a very destructive way. They're not concentrating as they should. We should be emptying our minds of everything except this problem, which we want to solve, but rather they were intruding on themselves. So we found that by calling it a math anxiety clinic, just to move through this a little more quickly, and having, you see the kind of invitation, using funny cartoons, and bringing them in to examine their own feelings. Now, to the world of educators, it might have appeared at that time that this was not relevant to math. What do feelings have to do with math? Well, my argument was, until proven otherwise, feelings can be very intrusive in the learning of math. And even those students who do very well, they're being buoyed up by their feelings of power, but sometimes they hit a problem they can't solve, and they lose a lot of confidence. So that was my insight, and out of that came this Math Anxiety Bill of Rights, which was meant to empower students vis-a-vis their math instructor. You can't be just sitting there passively suffering. You have to take some action. And the Math Anxiety Bill of Rights was developed by somebody else at University of Michigan. And if you read them, you realize it's an empowerment. I have the right to learn at my own pace and not feel put down. Some of us are slow to chew over things. We get to the place we want to go slowly. Some of us get to the place we need to be on another route. We have a personal relationship with a difficult subject. As a writer, I know that as well as anybody. I will write something that is not good, and then it's my knowledge of myself as a reader that helps me make it better. I have the right to ask whatever question I have. There's no such thing as a dumb question. If it's a question, it has the right to be asked. And many students don't ask questions. They're inhibited by feeling, because maybe their neighbor sitting next to them says, oh, that's a dumb question. There's a lot of tendency among us, as younger people, not so much when you get older, to decide whether a question is a good question or not. There is no bad question. If that question is inhibiting my moving forward, it's a legitimate question. It deserves to be asked. It deserves to be answered. And that's a warning to the teachers. I have the right to need extra help. Why am I lesser? I'm at a university. My job here is to learn. Your job is to teach. Why can't I say I need extra help? I have a different foreign language at home, or I have a certain lack of visualization, or I have a lack of practice, or I'm working 12 hours a week. I have a right to ask for extra help. Where is it written that you have to get it the first time? How many of you have gotten it the third time, or the fourth time, or the umpteenth time? But the important thing is you get it. And as you get it the umpteenth time, you are filing away a process of getting it that you will use later. The last time I saw this chemistry problem, I had to anticipate what the units would be in order to get a handle on it. That's how I do chemistry, by the way. Why is that wrong? Why is that bad? Why can't I do it the way that feels natural to me? It's so obvious to me, and yet we have restricted a lot of our learners to a predetermined mode of problem solving. And problem solving should be as creative a process as writing a book, because we all come to these problems differently. I have a right to say I don't understand. Why is it evil? I don't understand. I have a problem I thought I could do. I started, it didn't go right. I don't understand. I need help. I have the right not to understand. Realize the potency of that statement. I have the right to not understand. I am a student. You are an instructor. I have the right to not understand the first time or the third time or the fifth time. That's a way of feeling good about yourself as a learner and not berating yourself. I have a right to feel good about myself regardless of my abilities. I have the right not to base my self-worth on my math skills. I have the right to relax. I have the right to dislike math. That's okay. I need it in order to finish engineering or to do chemistry, but I have a right to dislike it. You know, where is it written that I have to like every subject that leads me to the profession I want? So these were, it may surprise you, very revolutionary ideas back in the 1970s, that students had rights, that students had needs, and very often unique needs. They weren't like everybody else in the class. How can the teacher help us if we don't raise our hand and say, what's confusing me is, I mean, we are depriving our teachers of the capacity they bring with them to class of helping us if we can't articulate what it is that's difficult. So it was a terrific experience. I think the high point of writing that book was partly it was a bestseller. It's nice to have your first book a bestseller, but also it was the cartoon that's on the second or third page. That is a cartoon about Lucy. You remember Lucy and Charlie Brown? Some of you old enough. And I was so flattered when I got mentioned in a cartoon. Somebody said, that's real immortality. Doesn't matter what the reviewers say. And it was with Lucy, and she says, sir, you have math anxiety. Then we looked a little more at my signal-to-noise ratio. The brain schematic is a visual expression of the way I understand signal-to-noise ratio to be. You see something new in math. It could be a problem to solve. It could be just a new concept. And you enter it in your brain, willingly. That's what you're in school to do. And in some of us, the pathway to memory is very straightforward. Look on the left of this diagram. And it goes into memory, and it's accessible to us as needed. I have just learned this new formula or this new way of doing math, and when I need it, I'm going to be able to call on it because it's in my memory. But then there's a student sitting right next to me for whom there's so much anxiety and self-denigration. This is the kind of problem I can never solve. Somebody who thinks that way, that same signal has encountered what is known in engineering as noise in the system, and can't be stored in memory for reasons that are almost physical. I'm not a brain scientist, but there are feelings we've all had. I just can't learn that. I can't memorize that. I can't understand that. And then we need a different kind of help. And it's not having the problem or the statement repeated. That doesn't do very much good. It requires somebody to help us think through what it is about our brain that is resisting this concept. And out of that kind of reflection comes real insight. I think everybody in this audience who has succeeded at doing research, the faculty here, knows that very often the great insight came after struggling with something that made no sense at all the first time you saw it. And I certainly have had that experience as a writer. And we did find some differences between males and females. We can't deny those. Has to do with what we call socialization. That when you're a little girl, you're 5 or 6, and you ask for a chemistry set because you've heard about them or seen one, or some little boy you know has one, and your parents say, whoa, don't you dare go there. You get a message about what's appropriate for girls and what's not appropriate for girls. And so in the end, I concluded, and I was unique in doing this because nobody was talking about mental health and math. They're both beginning with M, but people thought you go into a math class and you are using your brain in some completely independent way. It's like a physical, the brain and the subject, and then you apply the brain to the subject, and then you have it. And I suggested in my books, that one and 2 others I wrote about math, that math mental health is essential. So that was phase 1. I wrote Overcoming Math Anxiety, Succeed with Math, and then I turned to science, partly because of my marriage. You marry a physicist, and you really have to get some physics under your belt. But besides that, it was the goal of many of us who want to see students do better in math was to understand what makes science hard. One of my colleagues, a physicist from Loyola, thought it was just another version of anxiety. And he knew that I had written a bestseller. Everybody was talking about math anxiety, so he told me he was going to write a book about science anxiety. It was going to be a parallel story, and up at Loyola, he hired a psychologist to help him with students who were resisting science, and then he wrote a book called Science Anxiety, and he asked me to write the introduction. Well, when you're a scholar and you have friends, that's what you do. So I read his book, and I thought, he's wrong. Now what do? Do you not write an introduction? Do you write an introduction? Why was he wrong? Because my experience and your experience is that science, the math issues start in elementary school. That's when children are young and they're easily scared and they're sent to the blackboard and they bring anxiety with them. The math tests are time tests. They're hard tests. And as far as my analysis was concerned, math anxiety starts in elementary school. But what is science like in elementary school in the United States? Science is fun. You're growing plants, you're bringing in little animals and little insects. You're open, I mean, people aren't demanding a right answer in those early years. You're not solving chemistry problems. You're exploring the universe, and it is, if you have reasonable mental health, it's fun. It was fun for all of us. And then what happens? Something happens later when you get to high school chemistry and high school physics and biology, and it becomes difficult. So I thought my friend, though I respected him, and I tried not to tell him this, but of course I had to, was wrong. That science avoidance was different from math anxiety. So there were two bad things. First, temporarily I lost a friend because I wouldn't write the introduction. And secondly, I had to start over and try to answer for myself the question, what makes science hard, if it's not what makes math hard? So I just had another several years of work. And the answer to the question, that's the second handout, of what makes science hard, brought me back to scientists who are, I would say, not very friendly to people who find science hard, if I can say that in a university context. I had reason to visit a lot of schools, and I heard at one institution, not unlike this one, two physicists talking about the following new word on campus. This is in the 80s, so it was a long time ago. We're hearing, they said one to the other, that the hardest class now isn't physics anymore, it's computer science. And the answer, the response from the other physicists was, we'll have to do something about that. What does that tell us? There's a population in our universities being paid to teach, being paid to open the world of science to young people who are competing for which of their subjects is the hardest. Well, that gave me a clue that the work was going to have to be very different from math anxiety work. I wasn't going to have to work on the learner. I had a lot of sympathy for the learners and trying to survive this environment. I was going to have to work on the faculty. So I took as my second book task to try to figure out what makes science hard, with the quotation marks around hard. What makes it hard? And I spent the next 20 years trying to answer that question. But there are operational definitions when you're starting a research project, and those of you who are in research know this already. You're trying to find an answer to the question, what makes science hard? The subsidiary question is, who do you ask? What do you ask them? And how do you evaluate their answer? I took as my guide, by then I was married to the physicist, so I had some help. I took as my guide the technique of isolating a single variable, which scientists do all the time, and engineers, when they're trying to get an answer to a question. So the variable for me was what makes science hard, perceived to be hard. But there's a lot going on in a student. Students are younger, they're less experienced, they have inhibitions, they have prior bad experience. So how was I going to do an experiment that eliminated from all the variables, and you've heard this terminology before in science research, except one, and that one was newness to the field. You're a 17-year-old, you're an 18-year-old, you're in an intro physics class. What are you bringing to the physics class? You don't know physics, that's one variable. You are scared of physics because the word out is physics is very hard, right? So you'd be insane not to be a little bit afraid. And you are new, very new to the field. So what I did was what every scientist tries to do in an experimental model. I tried to remove all the variables except newness to the field. I tried to find a population of learners who were equal in every other respect. They didn't know physics, but in every other respect, equal to the faculty member. Who are those people who are equal in every other respect to the physics faculty member, except knowing physics? They're the faculty in other fields. And I did something that, to my surprise, nobody had ever thought to do before. And that was to gather in experimental settings faculty from literature, from theology, from social science, from MPA, as surrogate learners, that is, learners only for the sake of the experiment, not of a whole course, that would be impossible to organize, but of a specific subject lecture in physics or chemistry it got. And I went around the country and made an offer to faculty if they would make a volunteer physicist available to offer a lecture at sort of the sophomore level, but not presuming prior knowledge. It had to be something like waves in elastic media, something that you could really express, and then give the hour lecture to, not students, but a group of surrogate learners, fake learners for that era, that evening, and they would be from English and history and geography, other fields, and have them keep a record, again, the same divided page, a record of their observations about what was making it difficult for them. They're not inhibited, they're very sure of themselves, they have PhDs in other fields, and now they're being thrust into a setting where they are new to the field. They have the brains, they have the capacity for concentration, they have a lot of confidence in themselves, more than freshmen, but they are new to the field of waves of elastic media, intro physics, and then have them take notes on one half side of the page, and on the other half, write observations about themselves, how they found themselves dealing with these inhibitions or this sense of being not very smart. And from those, I wrote an article that appeared in Physics Today, the wonderful thing about, or the American Journal of Physics, the wonderful thing about the physics world is if you ask a question they haven't thought of, they are hooked. I'm married to one, so that's who they are. They just are really interested in questions. And so even though the question was leading eventually to criticizing the way in which physics is taught, they were intrigued, and my articles got published in the American Journal of Physics. So what they showed was, and these were very honest respondents, and I did it in a dozen, well, maybe not a dozen, 8 or 9 different institutions, Florida and UCSD, and my own university. What they showed was a tendency on the part of the instructor not to meet the needs of the learner. These learners were in every respect equal to the instructor, maturity, wealth of brains, and that they were accomplished scholars, but didn't meet their needs. So example, this lecture, of course, used demonstrations. I mean, you don't teach physics without demonstrations. And he would pull, you've seen this if you took physics, they pull a tablecloth out from under some standing glasses and things. Have you all seen this? Yeah. It's a very difficult experiment to set up. It's a demonstration for a lecture. And in these lectures for the faculty, their colleagues from other fields, they didn't get it. I mean, he went to all this trouble setting up this demonstration, then he pulled the rug out, so to speak, from the glasses, and nothing broke. It worked very well, and they just didn't get it. And so in the commentary that I solicited from the surrogate learners, from these fake learners who were faculty members, my favorite was from a theologian who said, "There's certainly a lot more equipment in your field than in mine." One of my favorites. But the other very, very good one was from a woman who was trying really hard to get it. And she said, I needed him to do that experiment a second time because I didn't know what to look for the first time. Perfectly legitimate. There was no way he was going to do that a second time. It took him 45 minutes to set it up the first time. And there were comments about that, about the use of language. I had them do the left-hand side, right-hand side, out of which came some great insights for the faculty in physics. They hadn't actually paid as much attention to what makes things difficult because they were teaching to younger, less experienced, not as smart, they think, people. And here they were teaching to colleagues they knew because they were on the same faculty who were very smart and very insightful. I then realized, I was told, of course, by critics, the one thing about physics is they have a lot of critical opinions. And they said, all very well, Sheila, but this is just a 1-hour experiment. Try it with some outsiders to science, physics, as it turned out, chemistry as well, who are taking the whole course, who are going to lab, who are doing problem sets, who are doing exams. Let's have a complete experimental design. And all I needed to do that was money. And there was a foundation in Tucson willing to let me do that. And out of that came the book that has been more widely read and reviewed by science faculty and science deans in the United States than any other book I ever read. And it was called They're Not Dumb, They're Different. It's a profound observation about people who appear to have difficulties in the physical sciences, who are assumed to be dumb because they can't do this, it's so obvious, but are not dumb, but different. So what did I do? I went out looking for graduate students in other fields more like mine, literature or music or political science, and hired them. That's the advantage of having a foundation support the work, and paid them $1,000. Graduate students will do anything for $1,000, almost anything. And they were obliged to go to class, intro physics and intro chemistry at the university where I was working, and to take very careful notes of what they noticed about the presentation, about they went to labs, and about the exams, and about the interactions, and about the culture of the classroom, you could call it. And some of them were anthropologists. One of them was anthropologist, so she saw it as if she were going to a strange culture, and she was observing. And out of it came a book that is the most widely read, I think, book by science faculty in the United States ever. I think there were 50,000 copies were requested from the foundation. And the title of the book was They're Not Dumb, They're Different. And that was an insight that I could never have come to just thinking about the problem, but it was an insight that came out of these experiments. We, since I'm not a scientist, are not dumb, we're different. And if you want to reach us, you're going to have to figure out what we need and what we can't deal with. And that book is so well known, I don't even talk about it much anymore. But there were some lovely comments by these students who, by the way, did very well. There was one exception. They did as well as anybody would expect, A minus, B plus. And they were doing it somewhat part-time, and they were not very well trained. None of them, all of them had calculus. I just couldn't have, I had to load it to that extent in high school, if not in college. And among their comments, which were much quoted and I got well known for, was something like, my IQ, said one, was sufficient for physics. My obedience quotient was too low. That was a mature learner. She was already a graduate student. She had done very well in her own field. She noticed that there was a requirement to do things just the way the teacher did, to be obedient, not to ask too many questions. There were others who said that they would have done well because the lecture was good and the subject was interesting, but there was no community in the classroom, that the students were competing with one another because they were graded on a curve. And he was used to, he's a literature major, he was going to graduate school in literature. He was used to community in the class, learning as much from other students as from the instructor, and the rest, filled out 80 or 90 pages of a book. So that left me feeling both reassured that there was a role for an outsider in these fields to comment and critique, and enabled me to be a kind of informal consultant. One example, a last example from physics, I was a visiting scholar, you could say, at a university, not this one, in a physics intro class. And I asked the teacher, I always do, what is it you want me to do for you? What question are you having trouble dealing with? How can I be helpful? And his answer was, he can't get students to ask questions. Again, it was a Physics 1 course. If I should pay attention while I'm sitting there, notice things, what is it that inhibits them? He gets finished making what he hopes is a very clear presentation. He asks, are there any questions? And there aren't any. And he knows there have to be questions because he too was once a freshman. So he got all through and again asked questions, and there was no response. And afterwards, in the privacy of our communication afterwards, I said to him, your students may not know how to ask questions in science. This is an art form of itself. They don't know enough even to articulate what's troubling them. They don't know their own selves well enough. They're 17, 18, 19 years old. Question posing is an art that those of us who do research learn how to do. I've already revealed to you my own research. In every instance, I was asking a question that hadn't been asked before. Those things don't pop into your head. You have to work on them. So he said, well, what do I do? I said, here's what you do. Before the end of the class or any time in the semester, you model question asking. You model it yourself. You say, it's fake, but you say, if I were looking at this equation for the first time, I would be wondering, blah, blah, blah. If I had never seen the solution, a free body diagram, to represent this situation, I would need to know whether, how, what. You model question posing because what you are teaching is a group of students who are not yet confident enough or far enough along to pose a profound question that is bothering them. But the articulation of questions, as all of us know who've done research, is half of the job of doing research. He had never thought of that. Very, very devoted teacher, eager to have feedback. He never thought that his students need to learn how to ask questions. It was the question and the answer. They needed to know how to find answers. That's just one small example of the advantage of bringing outsiders into the teaching learning situation. So I wanted to just tell you very briefly what else I've been working on once I got all that done. I was still youthful and full of energy. And now I'm trying very hard to persuade a very large number of people at the federal level and in universities that engineering deserves to be taught at some level to every student in the university. Our lives now are so impacted by engineering, what is built, what is not built, some of the obvious issues. There are 16 grand challenges of engineering that the National Academy of Engineering has listed and has explained, every one of which can be accessed, in my opinion, and that of your friend Chris. Everyone can be accessed, not solved, by non-engineers, accessed, understood, but they have to be given a place in the curriculum for the expression of these issues. And I take the position that they can be taught to non-engineers, not the way engineers are taught, but it's worthwhile walking up that steep path to figure out how people like myself, who are good learners but haven't had the benefit of engineering 101 or 102, how we can grasp the essence of these subjects if this planet is going to survive. Part of our problem is that 2/3 or 3/4 or 7/8 of the population don't think like scientists and can't process some of the information that is really out there and ready. So, as is the case with all researchers, the questions never stop coming. We don't have to worry about running out of things to do. I'd like to stop now and open this for discussion. Thank you for listening.